Dr. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Pet Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Roberta Westbrook, and welcome to the William and Evelyn Griffin Campus for All Animals. Thank you for joining us today. So we have an exciting topic for you today. You know, we always wonder about health issues and whether health issues are different between female pets and male pets. So today we're going to talk about health issues that affect female pets only or predominantly. So if you have a female pet and you are concerned about the reproductive tract or things that occur in female dogs, please get those questions ready, put them in the chat, and hopefully I can help you. In the meantime, I do want to introduce you to our pet of the week. Our pet of the week is Onyx. She is such a girl. She's a female. She's about 3 years old. She's spayed, and she was rescued from a hoarding case. So you all know that we spend a lot of our efforts to prevent animal cruelty. And unfortunately, Onyx was one of those animals that wasn't well taken care of in her previous home. It was a hoarding case, and so she came from a home with lots of other pets. And so she's a little bit shy, but very well behaved and enjoys pets, as you can see right there. So please come on down to our adoption center and take a look at all the dogs and cats and puppies and kittens that we have available, and rabbits, and consider adopting a pet and taking a pet into your home. We're always welcome to have you as part of our family. So, you know, let's get started and talk about some of the health conditions that occur in female dogs and cats. So I want to warn you, I do have some real anatomical structures here that I want to show you because you may be wondering what the difference is between a human uterus in females and maybe a canine or feline, a dog or cat uterus. And so when we are spaying a female, you've heard that before, when a female gets spayed, where we are removing the reproductive organs, I do have an example of what that looks like. So when you hear your veterinarian mention spaying your female dog, essentially what's happening is we are removing the ovaries. There are two of them, the ovaries, and we are also removing the uterine horns and the body of the uterus. Now, I will mention that we use different terms for these structures in dogs and cats than you may be used to hearing in humans. So these structures here are what we call ovaries. I have two separate uteruses here. One of them is from a very small cat. The other one is from an adult cat. And so you can see the difference in size. And so these are the ovaries. We remove the ovaries. And then these long structures here on the side that form somewhat of a Y shape, those are the uterine horns. In humans, those would be equivalent to the fallopian tubes. The difference is in animals, these are much longer. And this is actually where the fetuses, the puppies or kittens, where the fetuses would attach when a animal is pregnant. So they would be attached in these horns here, and they would grow in the horns there. The body of the uterus in dogs and cats is much smaller. In humans, it's in the body where the fetus of a human baby would attach. So slightly different there. And the ovaries are where there are hormones being produced. So this is where the hormones are produced, and they typically cause a lot of the health issues that we're going to talk about today. So there's some example for you about what we are actually removing when we spay your pet.
So then do females get, periods like we do?
Great question. So yes, the general term period refers to, people are usually referring to bloody discharge from the vagina. In people, we call this menstruation. Menstruation is when the lining of the human uterus is sloughed and you see the bloody vaginal discharge that way. In dogs, that is not called menstruation. We say that dogs have an estrus cycle or a heat cycle. And in those cases, the bloody discharge that we notice is coming from the walls of the vagina. So it's not actually coming from the uterus like it is in people, it's coming from the vagina. And so those two processes are different. But if we say period, and we're talking about bloody vaginal discharge, essentially physically and visually, it looks the same.
And then how long are dogs in heat for?
So dogs tend to be in heat for an average of 9 days. But let me explain to you, because the stage of their estrus cycle that we recognize as being in heat is actually 2 separate stages. The first stage is called proestrus, and the second stage is called estrus. Well, you don't need to know those fancy terms, but you do need to know that during both of those stages, that's when we see the bloody vaginal discharge. Each of those phases can last about 9 days. So you could have about 18 days or sometimes longer of that bloody vaginal discharge if you have an intact female dog. We do recommend that you spay your dog. We're going to talk about some health issues that spaying can help prevent. So if we can prevent those health issues by spaying your dog, we recommend that. But certainly if you have an intact female, that's the information about the heat cycle.
And we occasionally hear the term breeding season in Houston, or kitten season. So does weather affect a cycle?
Yes, it absolutely can. This is a great question. So when we talk about dogs, for example, dogs go into heat about every 6 to 8 months. And so the stages of the heat cycle last about 6 to 8 months, and then they start all over again. In cats, that cycle is continuous, and it's usually in the spring and summer months. And so cats will come in and out of heat about every 1 to 2 weeks. And so about every 1 to 2 weeks, they're in heat again. And so you might notice that your cat is very vocal, that your cat may be lifting her rear end when she's in heat. And so you don't see the bloody vaginal discharge in cats that you do in dogs, but you can usually see them becoming very loving, and you can see them kind of raising their rear end and moving their tail to the side when they're in heat. And yes, that is seasonal, tends to be spring and summer when we see that in cats, but dogs, it's just twice a year.
A common myth is that dogs have to go through one cycle before getting spayed. Can you touch a little bit about that?
Yes, there's been certainly some controversy about when to spay your female dog. Overwhelmingly, we recommend spaying before the first heat cycle. And the reason is every time your dog has a heat cycle, they are at greater risk for developing potentially life-threatening illnesses, particularly mammary cancer. So every time your dog goes into heat, the chances of her developing mammary cancer later in life goes up. And so we'd like to prevent that. So spaying before the first heat cycle can help to do that. In some breeds of dogs, particularly if you have a purebred dog or large breed dog, some veterinarians may recommend that your dog reach full maturity before spaying, just so that the conformation of your dog is able to reach the best that it possibly can before spaying.
Are there any safe birth controls? I know the human world has a lot of birth control options. Is there anything similar to that in dogs?
We don't give dogs or cats birth control. We just recommend that you keep them separate from their boyfriends and not let them sort of be unattended during those times of heat, particularly if you're not looking forward to having a litter. We have lots of pets that are looking for homes in our community. We are always fighting pet overpopulation and making sure that every pet possible can find a home. So we certainly recommend not having a litter of puppies or kittens if you are not prepared to do that and find homes for them.
And if our dog is in heat, how do we prevent pregnancy during this time?
Yes, if your dog is in heat, please keep her indoors and away from other intact male dogs. So that might mean that you're going to walk her, on a leash at all times or only in your backyard. Keep her away from any male dogs. And certainly, male dogs will, especially if they're roaming the streets, they can sense that, they can smell the in-heat female, and they will search the female out. So it's just about keeping your pet separate from other intact male dogs.
And then someone says, how do I prevent stains on my carpet when my dog is in heat?
Okay, so there will be bloody vaginal discharge if your dog is in heat. And so you can purchase little diapers that you can put on your dog during those times while you're waiting to be scheduled for a spay. And so there's a little hole for the tail here, and then there's little Velcro that's going to go around their waist. And so they can certainly wear this during the time that they're in heat. But if you can get that spay scheduled, please contact your family veterinarian and try to get the spay scheduled as soon as possible.
And then can you talk about false pregnancy? Is that a real thing? And when does that usually happen?
So yes, false pregnancy is a real thing in dogs. And, I mentioned earlier the stages of the estrus cycle in dogs and cats. And I mentioned proestrus and I mentioned estrus. Well, after those first two stages, the bloody vaginal discharge goes away. And then we are in a phase called diestrus. And in that phase, that is when the female's body acts as if it's pregnant. And so during that time, if the hormones during that time, progesterone, are extreme, or the dog or cat is actually very sensitive to progesterone, sometimes they can show signs that look like they're pregnant. They will have a distended belly. Their mammary glands will start to become developed, and they may even start to lactate and secrete milk. They will even start to nest, and they may kind of create a nest with towels or blankets. They may find stuffed animals or items around the house that they are beginning to treat as if they are puppies or kittens. So they can have kind of a stage of false pregnancy where they are acting as if they're pregnant. It's all a hormonal response. It's in response to a hormone called progesterone. This typically goes away on its own. Okay. So when they are pregnant, progesterone will drop suddenly and they will give birth. If they're not pregnant and it's a false pregnancy, progesterone will still taper down. It'll still drop off, and those signs will go away. The best way to prevent it is to get your dog spayed so that they're not going through that every heat cycle.
Can they adopt orphan newborns during that time, especially if they are producing milk?
Sure. If they are producing milk, certainly that has happened where there's been some orphan newborns and they've been able to kind of be adopted by a lactating mom. And those are always wonderful stories because however we can help those little puppies survive is great. So yes, there have been wonderful stories of a lactating mom taking in some orphan newborns.
And speaking of hormones, do dogs ever go through menopause, or does a spay equal a menopause?
We don't recognize that syndrome in dogs. As I mentioned, in humans, we call it menstruation, and that's sort of related to menopause, where that menstrual cycle goes away, and you start to see other physical manifestations of the lack of hormones that are available. In dogs, as female dogs get older, certainly they do start to have unpredictable heat cycles, and they get further and further apart. But I can't say that we recognize any physical abnormalities that we would call or be equivalent to menopause.
And then when we're removing, I guess, the things that produce the hormones, is there any side effects to that behavior wise that, a lot of people are scared that, I don't want to spay my dog because they're going to act different?
Yes. So, we have lots of those common myths that if you're spaying your dog, that they're going to act different. And really they don't. Certainly there's some anecdotal evidence that, particularly in males, I think it's probably more common in males that people are concerned their male dog is not going to be, as active or sometimes as protective as they would be if they were not neutered. They need that testosterone. In females, we don't tend to see a lot of behavioral changes at all. Some people will associate the lack of hormones with weight gain. But that can easily be fixed with proper diet. So one of the concerns about spaying the dogs is weight gain, and we do tend to see that, but we can fix that with proper diet and exercise.
And you mentioned mammary cancer in unaltered females. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So mammary cancer certainly can develop in unspayed females, and the more heat cycles or estrus cycles that a dog or a cat has, the higher their chances are of getting mammary cancer in their old age. And mammary cancers develop in the mammary glands, and they're usually just small nodules. They can be large, but they're usually small nodules in the mammary tissue. And in order to know whether they are benign masses or tumors or whether they're malignant, your veterinarian will have to do tests on those masses. So they will need to test those masses, remove them, and see if they are benign or malignant. But we want to be able to prevent that. And so spaying your dog before the first heat cycle is the best way to do that.
And what about ovarian cancer? How frequent is that in unspayed females?
Yes, ovarian cancer can occur. It's not very common. And I think the reason it's not very common is because we do such a good job at spaying our females. And that's what we want. We want to be able to prevent these things. So if we spay the female, we are removing the ovary. And so there's not going to be any chance for ovarian cancer. But in the event that there is an older unspayed female, certainly cancers can develop in the ovaries and they can become large abdominal masses. There's not a lot of clinical signs except that your pet may start to feel some pain in the abdomen. Your veterinarian may be able to feel the mass in the abdomen. But again, the treatment is going to be to spay the dog as soon as possible.
And what is mastitis in relation to dogs? Is it the same thing as in humans when, we're nursing?
Yes. So mastitis is inflammation of the mammary glands. And so it can be inflammation, but can also be infection. And we see this in dogs that have been lactating. Maybe they've given birth or maybe they've gone through a false pregnancy, but they have mammary tissue that has had milk production. And the mammary glands become enlarged and inflamed and often hot to the touch and very painful. And sometimes they can get infected. And this can be a pretty serious condition in some dogs. And so it's certainly important to see your family veterinarian if you feel like your pet is suffering from mastitis. There are medications that we can give to try to alter the hormones and try to help to reduce the milk production. There are things that your veterinarian may get you to do to try to reduce the milk production because we really want the milk in the mammary glands to dry up. And so the more we manipulate the mammary glands, sometimes the more they lactate and it can be worse. So veterinarians have medications and they may give you some tips to try to help the milk in those mammary glands dry up to prevent them from being too full and painful.
So another female specific kind of disease or infection can be bacterial vaginitis. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, bacterial vaginitis. So again, not a incredibly common condition, but certainly we can see it. And it's kind of exactly what it sounds like, bacterial. So there's bacterial infection in the vagina. So vaginitis is inflammation, infection in the vagina. And so certainly that can occur. The way that we would know this is if the vagina of the dog or the cat has discharge that looks abnormal. So that could be greenish or yellow or foul smelling discharge. Your pet may be licking their vagina often. They may scoot it becomes itchy. So sometimes they scoot their rear end trying to scratch the area around the vagina. And so if you're noticing those things, please see your family veterinarian so they can look at that area and see if there's any infection or inflammation there. And sometimes what we'll do is if we determine that there is infection, we can take swabs, we can take samples from the vagina and swab out the vagina and look at those samples under a microscope. When we look under the microscope, what we're looking for is bacteria and we're looking for inflammatory cells. And then when we take that sample, we can also send it to a lab and they can culture bacteria and they can give us a better determination about what type of bacteria is present and how to treat it. So it is something that occurs, not very common, but we can diagnose it and we can treat it because it's bacterial. We can provide some antibiotics and we can treat that condition relatively easily.
And is that the same as puppy vaginitis, just obviously in younger females?
Yeah, it sounds like it would be, right? Puppy vaginitis, but actually the causes are very different. So for puppy vaginitis, it usually is not bacterial in origin. And so when puppies have inflammation in their vagina, it's typically not bacterial. It's usually related to the hormones. And this is one case in which your veterinarian could recommend waiting to spay your dog until after their first heat cycle. Having one heat cycle in a puppy with vaginitis can help to prevent that vaginitis from becoming chronic as your puppy grows and becomes older.
And another infection term we've heard a lot is Pyometra. What is that and how common is it?
Yes, this is actually one of the most important conditions, life-threatening conditions that we want to prevent in our female dogs and cats. And it's called, again, Pyometra. So let's go back to that heat cycle. Remember I mentioned there is a part of the heat cycle called diestrus, where the hormone called progesterone is very high. Progesterone is important because when a dog is pregnant, progesterone helps to protect the fetus and it makes the environment in the uterus very nice for the fetus. It creates moisture, there's blood flow, and it prevents the uterus from contracting. So progesterone is very good if you have a pregnant animal. It's going to protect the pregnancy. However, progesterone can actually also cause an infection in the uterus called pyometra. So it makes for a wonderful environment for living organisms, but sometimes those living organisms are bacteria and not a fetus. And so you get a uterus that's full of bacteria. And if you look at the uterus example that I have here, one of them is significantly bigger than the other. And so when you see the uterus that is significantly bigger than the other, sometimes that is because there is inflammation or infection building up here. So in some animals, this can become 10 times normal because it's full of pus, essentially bacteria. And so it can be life-threatening. It can cause a systemic bacterial infection, and animals need to be spayed in an emergency situation. The way that you might know if your pet has a pyometra is if you have an intact female and you notice, not all the time, but you may notice that there's green or yellow vaginal discharge and foul odor. You might notice that your pet's belly becomes distended, and that's because the uterus becomes very enlarged. And you might notice that they don't feel good. They're not eating. They don't want to be active. They act sick. That's a sign of pyometra. And get to your veterinarian right away because it's an emergency situation. And typically veterinarians will want to do that surgery the same day or the next day, depending on how severe it is. But all of that is actually a result of hormones. So once we spay your female dog, all of those issues that I've discussed, the pyometra and the vaginitis, those things don't occur. And so overwhelmingly, we recommend getting your dog spayed so that we can prevent some of these conditions and help your pet to live a long, happy life.
And prevent unwanted litters.
And prevent unwanted litters, because we want to make sure that we have enough homes for all the dogs in our community. Well, I thank you for joining us today at the Pet Podcast and here at our Campus for All Animals. I'm so happy to talk to you guys every week. Come on down and visit Onyx and all the other dogs that we have available. She's so sweet, and she's just looking for her forever home. So please come on down and take a look. We'd love to have you join us in any way that you can. Please go to HoustonSPCA.org and help to support our mission. You know, just yesterday, we took in a group of about 50 small breed dogs that unfortunately were in a hoarding type situation. And so, you know, we're always trying to do the best that we can to prevent animal cruelty. And those dogs are here in a wonderful environment with people who are taking care of them. So if you are interested in supporting our mission, please go to HoustonSPCA.org and consider being a foster, considering being a volunteer, and being a part of our extended family. So thank you again so much for supporting us, and we will meet you next week on the Pet Podcast. Bye-bye.